May 1945. Camp Alva, Oklahoma. Behind the barbed wire fences of what had once been farmland, over 5,000 Japanese prisoners of war stood in formation under the blazing prairie sun, wondering if the rumors could possibly be true. After months of expecting harsh treatment, brutal interrogations, and the kind of vengeance their own military leadership had taught them to fear, these men were about to discover something that would shatter every assumption they had carried across the Pacific Ocean. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What happened in the wheat fields of Oklahoma would transform enemies into students, prisoners into farmers, and propaganda into a crisis of conscience that some would carry for the rest of their lives. Lieutenant Takeshi Yamamoto had been a pilot. 26 years old, son of a rice merchant from Osaka, he had flown reconnaissance missions over the South Pacific until his aircraft went down near the Marshall Islands in late 1944. The American sailors who pulled him from the water that day had given him medical treatment and fresh water. He had been too shocked to understand what it meant. Everything he had been taught said the Americans would treat him with contempt, perhaps cruelty. His training officers had been very clear about what capture would mean. They had painted vivid pictures of torture, starvation, humiliation beyond endurance. Better to die fighting, they had said, than to suffer such a fate. But here, in this vast camp in the middle of America, something else was happening entirely. Sergeant William Hayes of the United States Army stood at the entrance to Compound 3, clipboard in hand, watching the newest group of prisoners file past. Hayes was 32, a farmer from Nebraska before the conflict began, and he had requested this assignment specifically. Not because he harbored any sympathy for the enemy, but because he understood something about land, about growing things, and about how work could anchor a man when everything else had been stripped away. The camp commander, Colonel Robert Patterson, had unusual ideas about how to run a prisoner facility, and Hayes had volunteered to help implement them. He had seen enough of the conflict to know that cruelty bred only more cruelty, and he was curious whether a different approach might yield different results. The camp at Alva was one of dozens scattered across the American heartland. The government had made a calculated decision to place these facilities far from the coasts, deep in the interior, where escape would be nearly impossible and where the local populations might benefit from the labor arrangements. But Alva was different. Patterson had read the regulations, studied the international agreements, and decided that compliance with the minimum standards was not enough. If America was fighting for certain principles, he reasoned, then those principles should be visible even in how enemies were treated. It was not sentiment that drove him, but strategy. He believed that treating prisoners with dignity would serve American interests better than cruelty ever could. Yamamoto noticed it first at the mess hall. The portions were not starvation rations. They were not spoiled or contaminated. The rice was real rice, properly cooked. There was meat, not every day, but several times a week. Vegetables, bread. The American guards ate the same food, prepared in the same kitchens. He sat with his bowl, silent, trying to reconcile what he was experiencing with what he had been told to expect. Every bite contradicted years of propaganda. Every meal raised questions he was not yet ready to articulate. Corporal Hiroshi Nakamura, a former infantryman captured on Saipan, leaned across the table and spoke quietly. "Have you noticed the portions?" Nakamura had been a schoolteacher before conscription, a thoughtful man who had never quite shed the habit of analyzing everything around him. "This is more than we received in our own training camps. The irony is extraordinary." Yamamoto nodded slowly. "I have noticed. I do not understand it. Perhaps they are fattening us for some purpose we cannot see yet. Or perhaps," Nakamura said carefully, "they simply believe in following their own laws. The Geneva Conventions specify treatment standards. Maybe they actually adhere to them." Over the following weeks, the pattern continued. The prisoners were organized into work details, which was expected. What was not expected was the nature of the work and how it was supervised. Hayes led a group of about 80 men, including Yamamoto and Nakamura, to the surrounding farms. Oklahoma was producing wheat and cotton and cattle to feed the conflict effort, and labor was desperately short. The local farmers needed help. The prisoners needed occupation. The arrangement seemed logical on paper. What transformed it into something else was the way Hayes managed his detail. He did not stand over them with weapons drawn. He did not shout orders or demand impossible quotas. Instead, he taught. He showed them how American farming worked, the machinery, the techniques, the crop rotation strategies. He answered questions. When a prisoner made a mistake, Hayes corrected it with the same patient tone he would have used with his own sons. He treated them, in other words, like workers rather than enemies, like students rather than criminals. Thomas Wilson was a wheat farmer whose spread bordered the camp. 53 years old, weathered by decades of prairie sun and dust storms, he had lost his youngest son at Pearl Harbor. When Patterson first approached him about using prisoner labor, Wilson had refused. The anger was too fresh, the wound too deep. How could he accept help from the people whose nation had taken his boy? But Hayes had persisted, visiting Wilson's farm personally, explaining how the program worked, asking nothing except that Wilson consider it. Eventually, economics and curiosity won over grief. The first morning Wilson watched Japanese prisoners working his fields was May 28, 1945. He stood on his porch, coffee in hand, waiting for rage to surface. Instead, he felt something more complicated. They were so young, most of them barely 20, maybe 25. They worked with an intensity that reminded him of his own youth, that desperate determination to prove yourself worthy. One of them, a thin man with careful hands, was struggling with the mechanical seeder. Wilson watched Hayes demonstrate the technique again, watched the prisoner nod, try again, succeed. The young man's face showed such relief at getting it right that Wilson felt an unexpected pang of recognition. By noon, Wilson had walked down to the field. He brought water, real cold water from his well, and handed cups to the workers. They accepted with deep bows, uncertain, eyes darting to Hayes for permission or explanation. Wilson nodded at them, said nothing, walked away. But he came back the next day and the day after that. Something had shifted in him. Some burden had eased slightly, and he was not entirely sure what it meant. Yamamoto could not shake the growing dissonance. Every evening, back in the barracks, the prisoners would gather and compare experiences. The stories were remarkably consistent. The farmers treated them with a kind of rough fairness. The guards were watchful but not cruel. The camp had a library, actual books in Japanese brought in by the American government. There was a baseball diamond, recreation time, medical care that included dentistry, and eyeglasses for those who needed them. One prisoner had received surgery for an old injury and recovered fully. Another had been given medicine for chronic illness. These were not the actions of barbarians who wanted only to inflict suffering. Nakamura had become something of a spokesman for their group. One evening in June, he addressed perhaps 200 prisoners gathered in the main yard. "Brothers, we must think carefully about what we are experiencing here. We were told the Americans were devils, barbarians who would torture and starve us. We were told to die rather than surrender because capture meant unspeakable suffering. And yet look around you. We are fed, we are clothed, we are treated according to law. What does this mean for everything else we were told?" A young private named Kenji Sato spoke up, his voice shaking slightly. "It means we were lied to. Everything we were taught about the enemy was a lie." The silence that followed was heavy with implications. To acknowledge that their own leadership had deceived them was to question everything. The righteousness of their cause, the honor of their service, the sacrifices they had made and witnessed. It was too much for some. Arguments erupted, not with violence but with passionate words, men defending their beliefs against the evidence of their own eyes. Some insisted that Alva was an exception, a propaganda showcase designed to deceive them. Others pointed out that if this was propaganda, it was remarkably consistent and pervasive propaganda. Hayes watched these debates from a distance, understanding without speaking Japanese what was unfolding. He had seen it before, this process of disillusionment and reconstruction. Some prisoners withdrew into stubborn denial. Others became almost desperately eager to embrace their new reality, asking questions about American democracy, about farming techniques, about anything that might help them understand this strange new world. A few, like Yamamoto and Nakamura, existed in a kind of liminal space, caught between two incompatible worldviews, trying to construct a new understanding that could accommodate contradictory evidence. The turning point came in July. The camp administration announced that prisoners would be allowed to send letters home through neutral channels, Red Cross supervision, limited in length and subject to censorship, but real communication nonetheless. The opportunity to tell their families they were alive, to receive news from home, was overwhelming. Yamamoto spent 3 days composing his letter, weighing every word. What could he say? How could he explain what he was experiencing without sounding like he had betrayed his country? How could he describe being treated fairly by the enemy without implying that the enemy was not actually evil? In the end, he wrote simply about survival. He told his parents he was healthy, adequately fed, being treated fairly under the international conventions. He did not mention the library or the baseball games or the farmers who had begun to learn their names. He did not mention that he had started to question everything he had been taught about the American enemy. Some truths were too dangerous to commit to paper, even through neutral channels. He could not risk his family being questioned about his loyalty based on his words. Wilson's transformation was quieter, but no less profound. By midsummer, he knew the prisoners on his work detail by name. He learned that Yamamoto had studied literature before the conflict, that Nakamura had taught children, that young Sato dreamed of becoming an engineer. They were not faceless enemies anymore. They were men with stories, with families, with interrupted lives and uncertain futures. Wilson still grieved his son, still felt the sharp edge of that loss, but the presence of these young men had somehow made the grief more bearable rather than less. It was as if by seeing their humanity, he was honoring his son's humanity in return. One afternoon in August, Wilson did something that surprised even himself. He invited Hayes and a small group of prisoners, including Yamamoto and Nakamura, to sit on his porch for a cold drink. Not as guard and prisoners, but as men who had shared labor under the same sun. They sat in careful silence at first, until Wilson began to talk. He told them about his son, about the farm, about why he had initially refused to accept prisoner workers. He spoke plainly, without anger, just stating facts. My boy was 19 when he went in the service, barely knew which end of a rifle to hold. They sent him to Hawaii, and then the Japanese forces came and he was gone, just like that. Gone. Yamamoto listened with his head bowed. When Wilson finished, Yamamoto spoke in halting English he had been practicing. Sir, I am very sorry. For your son. For this conflict. I did not want these things. But I was soldier. I obeyed orders. This is what we do. Wilson looked at him for a long moment. I know you did, son. That is what soldiers do. That is why old men who start conflicts are not the ones who pay the price for them. It is always the young ones, the ones with their whole lives ahead, who end up paying with their futures and their grief. You remember that when you go home. The silence that followed was different, shared understanding rather than awkward uncertainty. Hayes watched it happen, this small bridge being built between men who should have been irreconcilable enemies, and he thought about what it meant for the world that would exist after the conflict ended. If two men who had every reason to hate each other could find common ground in a wheat field in Oklahoma, what else might be possible? Then came the morning of August 15th. The camp administration gathered all the prisoners and made an announcement that would reshape everything yet again. The conflict was over. The imperial government had surrendered. The terms were unconditional. Japan had been defeated. For many of the prisoners, this news was more devastating than capture had been. Their honor, their purpose, the meaning of their suffering, all of it had been predicated on the belief that their nation would ultimately prevail. Now that foundation had crumbled. Everything they had endured, every sacrifice they had made, it all seemed suddenly meaningless. The camp descended into a strange grief. Some prisoners wept openly, others became withdrawn, almost catatonic. A few celebrated quietly, relieved that the killing was finally done. But most existed in shocked numbness, trying to process what surrender meant. Yamamoto sat on his bunk, staring at nothing, remembering every propaganda speech about how surrender was impossible, how the divine spirit of the nation would ensure victory. It had all been empty promises, the certainty that had sustained him through training, through combat, through capture. It was gone now, leaving only questions. Nakamura found him there and sat down beside him. "We have a choice to make now, brother. We can cling to the lies we were told and die inside, or we can accept what we have learned here and try to build something new with that knowledge. The defeat is real. We cannot change that, but we can choose what we do with it." Yamamoto looked at him with hollow eyes. "What have we learned? That the enemy we were taught to hate is not who they told us. That defeat does not mean the end of honor. That there might be a different way to live, to think, to be in the world. The Americans have shown us something here, whether they meant to or not. They have shown us that strength does not require cruelty, that victory does not demand the destruction of the defeated. Think about it. We are their prisoners. They could have treated us any way they wished. Who would have stopped them? And yet they chose this. They chose to feed us adequately, to treat us with basic respect, to teach us instead of punishing us. That choice matters." In the weeks that followed, as the prisoners awaited repatriation arrangements, the work continued, but with a different quality. The Japanese men knew they would be going home to a devastated nation, to cities in ruins, to an uncertain future under occupation. Some of the prisoners began to ask Hayes and Wilson and the other Americans questions about democracy, about farming cooperatives, about how communities rebuild after disaster. They were gathering tools for the reconstruction they knew would be necessary. They asked about crop yields and irrigation systems. They asked about how American towns organized their governments. They asked about schools and hospitals, and everything that would need to be built from rubble. Patterson had always intended the camp to be a demonstration of American values, though he had never put it quite that explicitly. Now, with the conflict over, he saw the wisdom of that approach bearing fruit. The prisoners were not returning home as broken men filled with resentment and thoughts of revenge. They were returning with a more complicated picture of their former enemy, one that might influence how they participated in Japan's rebuilding. They had seen that Americans could be fair, could be generous, could treat even their enemies with a measure of dignity. That knowledge would shape their future choices in ways large and small. In September, as the first groups prepared for departure, Wilson did something unprecedented. He hosted a small gathering at his farm for the prisoners who had worked his fields. Hayes arranged the security, and about 20 Japanese men sat with Wilson under the Oklahoma sky for one last meal. Wilson and his wife had prepared food, a mix of American and what they hoped were Japanese flavors, though they admitted they had no real expertise. The effort itself was the message. "We see you as people," the meal said without words. "We recognize your humanity even as you leave as defeated enemies." Yamamoto stood to speak, his English much improved by months of practice. "Mr. Wilson, Sergeant Hayes, all the people of this place, we came here as enemies. You had every right to treat us with anger, with cruelty. We would have understood it. We were prepared for it. Instead, you showed us something we did not expect. You showed us fairness. You showed us that even in conflict, there can be humanity. This is something we will carry home with us. This is something we will remember when we rebuild our country. We will tell our children that Americans can be more than their government, more than their military. They can be kind." Wilson nodded slowly, emotions working across his weathered face. "You carry that home, son. You carry it home, and you remember that men are not nations. Governments make conflicts, but people, just regular people, they are the ones who have to live with the consequences. You make sure when you get back to Japan that you help build something where regular people matter more than they did before, where fathers don't lose their sons to old men's ambitions." The repatriation ships left from California ports through October and November of 1945. Yamamoto and Nakamura traveled together, along with hundreds of other former prisoners from Camp Alva and the other Oklahoma facilities. The ocean crossing gave them time to talk, to process, to think about what awaited them. Japan was defeated, occupied, fundamentally changed. The world they had known was gone. The question was what would replace it. They spent long hours on deck watching the waves, discussing how they might apply what they had learned, how they might help rebuild not just the physical nation, but the ideas that sustained it. When they finally reached Yokohama Harbor, the devastation was worse than they had imagined. The city was rubble and ash, the people hollow-eyed and desperate. But amid the ruins, Yamamoto saw something else. He saw Japanese workers cooperating with American occupation forces, not with servility, but with pragmatic determination. He saw food distribution centers operated jointly. He saw the beginning, however tentative, of reconstruction. And he saw that the Americans who occupied Japan seemed to be following the same principles he had witnessed in Oklahoma. They were not conquerors seeking only to extract and humiliate. They were administrators attempting, however imperfectly, to help rebuild what had been destroyed. Nakamura returned to teaching. The school building in his village had been destroyed, but classes were held outdoors while rebuilding began. He taught mathematics and literature, but also something less tangible. He taught his students that defeat was not the end of dignity, that learning from former enemies was not betrayal, but wisdom. He never directly contradicted the nationalist narratives his students had absorbed, but he offered alternative perspectives, asking questions that encouraged them to think critically. What is strength, he would ask them? Is it the ability to dominate others, or the ability to help others flourish? The students did not always understand what he was doing, but some did, and they carried those questions forward. Yamamoto took a different path. He got involved in agricultural cooperatives, bringing American farming techniques to Japanese villages struggling with food production. The irony was not lost on him that he had learned these methods as a prisoner from the enemy, and now they might help feed his starving countrymen. He worked tirelessly, moving from village to village, teaching crop rotation and mechanical equipment use and cooperative organization. He rarely spoke about his time in Oklahoma, but the lessons from that experience shaped everything he did. Every field he helped plant was a small rebellion against the hatred that had led to such destruction. In 1952, 7 years after the conflict ended, Yamamoto received an unexpected letter. It had been forwarded through multiple channels, and the envelope was worn from travel. Inside was a photograph and a note. The photograph showed Wilson's farm, the wheat fields golden under summer sun. The note was simple. Thought you might like to see how the harvest came in this year. Good yield. Hope you are well, and that Japan's recovery continues. Thomas Wilson. Yamamoto stood in his small apartment in Tokyo, holding that photograph, and wept. Not from sadness, but from the overwhelming recognition of connection, of shared humanity that had somehow survived conflict and distance and time. He wrote back immediately, telling Wilson about the cooperative work, about the changes happening in Japan, about how the lessons from Oklahoma had found fertile ground in reconstruction. He told Wilson that every time he taught a farmer about crop rotation, he thought of those Oklahoma fields. Every time he helped organize a cooperative, he remembered how the American farmers had worked together. They corresponded for years after that, these two men who had been enemies and became something else. Their letters were never frequent, perhaps 1 or 2 each year, but they maintained a thread of connection that symbolized something larger. In a world that had been torn apart by ideology and nationalism and industrial violence, individual people had found ways to see each other as human beings rather than abstractions. It was not a dramatic revelation, not a grand political statement. It was simply two men who had shared labor and conversation and who refused to let that connection be erased by history. Hayes continued to work with veterans programs after the conflict, helping both American soldiers and former prisoners reintegrate into civilian life. He understood, perhaps better than most, how difficult that transition could be. The men who had experienced combat, who had been prisoners, who had witnessed the conflict's brutality, they carried invisible wounds that peacetime could not immediately heal. Hayes worked to create support networks, vocational training programs, counseling services. He believed deeply that the nation owed these men more than just gratitude. It owed them genuine assistance in rebuilding their lives. The Camp Alva facility was decommissioned in 1946. The barracks were dismantled. The barbed wire removed. The land returned to agricultural use. Within a few years, there was little physical evidence that thousands of prisoners had lived there. But the impact persisted in less visible ways. The farmers who had worked with the prisoners, the guards who had supervised them, the townspeople who had watched this experiment in humane treatment unfold. They all carried changed perspectives. Some of the guards became advocates for prison reform. applying the lessons they had learned about respectful treatment to domestic incarceration. Several of the local farmers maintained correspondence with former prisoners for years, building personal bridges across the Pacific. The town of Alva itself developed a quiet pride in how its prisoner camp had operated, recognizing that in a conflict marked by so much cruelty on all sides, they had managed something different. The broader implications took decades to fully understand. Japan's post-conflict reconstruction was influenced by thousands of small interactions like those at Camp Alva. Former prisoners who had experienced fair treatment became voices for democratic reform, for international cooperation, for moving beyond the militarism that had led to disaster. They were not the only voices, not even the loudest ones, but they were there contributing to a national conversation about what Japan would become. American policy toward occupied Japan was similarly influenced. The decision to pursue reconstruction rather than punitive occupation, to treat the defeated Japanese with relative dignity, to invest in rebuilding rather than extracting reparations, these policies were shaped in part by the experiences of men like Patterson and Hayes. They had seen firsthand that enemies could be transformed into something else when treated with basic respect and fairness. That lesson influenced how America approached the occupation. By the 1960s, both Yamamoto and Nakamura had become minor public figures in Japan. They wrote memoirs, gave occasional lectures, participated in cultural exchange programs. Their stories about captivity in America were compelling precisely because they defied expectations. They described not brutality, but fairness, not cruelty, but unexpected kindness. These narratives helped reshape how a generation of Japanese citizens understood the conflict and its aftermath. Wilson never became famous, but he lived a long life on his Oklahoma farm, watching the wheat grow year after year, maintaining his correspondence with Yamamoto, occasionally hosting Japanese visitors who wanted to see the place that had left such an impression on their relatives. He never forgot his son, never stopped grieving that loss, but he had found a way to live with it that honored the boy's memory without perpetuating hatred. The story of Camp Alva and its prisoners became a footnote in history, the kind of small detail that rarely makes it into textbooks. But for the men who lived it, for the farmers who employed them, for the families who corresponded with them afterward, it was anything but a footnote. It was proof that even in humanity's darkest moments, there were individuals who chose to behave better than circumstance required. It was evidence that enemies could see each other as human beings, that institutions could prioritize dignity over vengeance, that the seeds of peace could be planted even before the conflict officially ended. Yamamoto died in 1994 at the age of 75. His funeral was attended by family, former students, agricultural colleagues, and representatives from several American organizations. Among the flowers and condolences was a wreath from the Wilson family in Oklahoma, sent by Thomas's grandchildren. The card attached read simply, "In memory of friendship that transcended conflict." The wheat fields of Oklahoma still produce abundant harvests. The land where Camp Alva stood is now private farmland again, indistinguishable from the surrounding countryside. There are no monuments, no historical markers, nothing to indicate that something remarkable happened there. But the legacy persists in ways both visible and invisible. In the democratic institutions Japan built after defeat, in the agricultural techniques that spread through post-conflict reconstruction, in the personal connections that endured across oceans and decades, in the simple recognition that even enemies are human beings, deserving of basic dignity. The prisoners who lived at Camp Alva, who worked the Oklahoma fields, who experienced fair treatment when they expected cruelty, they carried that experience home and let it shape how they rebuilt their lives and their nation. The Americans who operated that camp, who chose to treat prisoners with respect, who saw enemies as potential allies rather than permanent threats, they helped demonstrate that America's stated values could be more than just propaganda. Both groups, former enemies, contributed to a post-conflict world that, while far from perfect, was built on slightly firmer ground because of their choices. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.